things are not always what they seem. A veteran police officer, trained to protect and serve, makes a mistake that changes the life of a promising young black man forever. What if I told you that, after everything, that same police officer makes a completely unexpected decision? Yes, you read that right. What begins as a tragedy involving prejudice and human failings turns into something much greater. A story of redemption, overcoming, and altruism. And no, this isn't just another simplistic forgiveness tale. We're talking about a real twist that will shake your deepest beliefs about responsibility, guilt, and the power of regret. Imagine putting yourself in the shoes of someone who, with a single act, almost destroys another person's future. Now, think about what it would take to confront this mistake and turn it into a path to healing. That's exactly what Steve, the ex-cop, finds himself forced to do. But the surprise is not just in his actions, but in the impact his decision has on the life of Paul, the young man he almost killed. It is at this point that the question that we all have to face arises. Is it possible to transform pain and tragedy into something that inspires and brings real change? Steve believed so, and you'll find out how. If this intrigued you, you won't want to miss the unfolding of this story of redemption and overcoming. Subscribe now and turn on notifications to discover how a simple decision can transform lives in ways you never imagined. What Steve did will surprise you. Steve, a dedicated sergeant, always believed his mission was to protect and serve, but everything changed on that fateful day. A routine operation turned into a tragedy when he mistakenly shot Paul, a young black man with a bright future. The weight of the mistake suffocated him, a mistake that almost cost the life of someone so promising. Overcoming this emotional drama seemed impossible for him, a police officer used to acting quickly. But now, trapped by remorse, he knew that no matter how much he tried to justify the circumstances, nothing would erase what he had done. Shaken by guilt and the unexpected turn of events in his career, Steve decided to leave the badge behind, hoping to find a path that would redeem him. The system he had sworn to protect had failed, but the real fault in his eyes was his. Without his uniform, Steve felt naked, vulnerable, something he hadn't experienced in years. The police gave him structure, a way to channel his protective impulses. But now, away from the corporation, he needed to face his ghosts head-on. It wasn't just the shot that haunted him, but what it represented. Paul wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a threat. He was just a young man with dreams, living in a poor neighborhood. While investigating Paul's condition, Steve discovered details that left him perplexed. How could he, someone who was supposed to care, be responsible for so much pain? Paul, with his own dreams, didn't deserve to be there, on the brink of death. Steve felt humility well up inside him, a feeling that wouldn't let him forget his mistake. With information in hand, Steve learned that Paul had been transferred to a nearby hospital and that his surgery had been successful. But recovery would be slow, marked by months of physical therapy. Steve, who had seen so many scenes of pain and suffering in his career, couldn't help but think that he had been responsible for yet another tragedy. He wondered if Paul could overcome this trauma, if he would have the strength to continue pursuing his dreams. Steve, now immersed in his reflections, began to realize that his path to redemption would not be simple. He would have to face the reality that, despite all his good intentions, he had harmed someone who wanted to help the world. The feeling of remorse was constant, accompanying him in every step he took. Steve began to reevaluate his past actions, trying to find some solace in the small things he could still do to make amends for his mistakes. But the truth is, no matter how much he wanted to, the past couldn't be undone. The only thing left now was to move forward with humility, seeking, in some way, to transform his guilt into altruism. But how could he do this? He knew he needed to see Paul, to understand who he was, beyond the victim of a tragic mistake. The police officer, who was now just Steve, was trying to put together the pieces of his life and his broken heart. So Steve, determined to find out more about the young man he almost killed, began investigating Paul's life. He wanted to understand who that young man was. With each new discovery, the shock increased. Paul wasn't just any student. He was someone with dreams that transcended his own existence. Paul had plans, and those plans involved helping others overcome their pain, deal with bullying, abandonment, and indifference. Steve couldn't believe the coincidence. That young man, whose life he almost took, wanted to save other young people. Steve saw himself reflected in Paul, in his own desires to fix the world. However, unlike him, Paul seemed to have a much clearer vision of how to do this. The more Steve discovered about Paul, the more he found himself trapped in a web of thoughts that left him distraught. If he, at that fateful moment, had hesitated for a second longer, perhaps things would have been different. He wondered what it would have been like if he had recognized Paul's humanity before he fired. This thought gnawed at him, taking away his sleep and leading him to reflect on the complexity of life. Steve knew he needed to do something. But what? What could he, now without a badge, do to repair the harm he caused? There was a twist waiting to happen in his mind, something that would lead him to make a surprising decision. With a heavy heart, Steve decided he couldn't continue living the same way. He needed a purpose, something that would give him a new direction. For years, he had been saving money, thinking about investing in a project that could have a social impact, but he never knew where to put those resources. Until now, Paul's story awakened something in him, a spark that made him reconsider everything. Maybe this was the time to act, to transform your pain into a force for change. With that in mind, he made a decision. He would look for Paul and, in some way, try to be part of his plans. Steve knew it wouldn't be easy. Paul, after all, had every right to reject him. As Paul recovered from surgery, each physical therapy session became a small step toward his new reality. He was a resilient young man, and despite the severity of what had happened, he refused to be defined by the incident. At the hospital, Paul soon became a charismatic figure, winning the sympathy of other patients and even staff. Always optimistic, he shared his ideas and plans with anyone who was willing to listen. It was difficult not to be inspired by the way he approached life after such a traumatic experience. Even with physical and emotional pain, Paul continued to talk about the future with enthusiasm, and this impressed everyone around him. Physiotherapy, for many, could be seen as a slow and painful process, but Paul saw it differently. For him, each exercise was an opportunity to reconnect with his body and, at the same time, plan the next steps in his life. He had already decided that his trauma would not be in vain. Paul wanted to turn his experience into something that could help others overcome their own struggles. During the sessions, he would talk about a project he had been planning for a long time, something he believed could change lives. A virtual space where people, especially children and young people, could find emotional support to overcome bullying and trauma. His ideas were buzzing, and the sparkle in his eyes showed that he was determined to make it happen. Paul dreamed big, but what touched the people around him most was the humility with which he presented his plans. He knew he couldn't do everything alone, and was always open to learning from those around him. He wasn't afraid to ask for advice or listen to the experiences of other patients who were also facing their own challenges. With this, Paul created a collaborative environment where everyone supported each other. His selflessness was evident, and everyone who knew him could sense that he was destined to do something truly meaningful. He not only wanted to heal his own pain, but to help others reframe their lives and transform their pain into something positive. Paul's plans to create an online psychological support community weren't just a distant dream. He had already started working on the details of the project while in the hospital. In conversations with nurses and other patients, he discussed the importance of addressing childhood trauma seriously. He talked about how technological advancement could be a powerful tool for connecting children and young people to mental health professionals on a platform that was accessible and efficient. His ideas went beyond the traditional. He wanted something dynamic, where each child could find the right support for their specific situation, a place where bullying and indifference would no longer have space. Despite the difficulties, Paul was not willing to give up on his dreams. He knew that overcoming his own drama was the first step to inspiring others to follow the same path. And that's what he wanted most, to be a source of inspiration for young people who felt alone, without hope. He believed that everyone deserved a second chance, and that, with the right support, it was possible to turn any pain into learning. He not only dreamed of creating a safe and welcoming environment online, but also of being part of something bigger, something that could truly make a difference. Physical recovery was just the beginning. He knew he had much more to achieve. During his conversations with healthcare professionals at the hospital, Paul highlighted the importance of empathy in the healing process. He firmly believed that what traumatized children needed most was someone who would truly listen to them, who would offer genuine support. And for Paul, that was the centerpiece of his platform. He wanted young people to have access to specialized psychologists and coaches who would help them reframe their childhood experiences. He imagined that through virtual sessions, children could access care that was often inaccessible to low-income families like his. Paul's vision was not just theoretical. He believed in the power of technology to democratize access to mental health. Inspired by successful initiatives in the technological field, he studied how large startups had used the internet to create disruptive solutions in different areas. Paul wanted to do the same in the field of child psychology. For him, this was the real turnaround the world needed, a space where people could be welcomed, regardless of where they were, and where their traumas could be healed. This was his mission, and he knew that, despite all the challenges, this was the right path to follow. As he talked about his plans, Paul's eyes shone with a mixture of determination and hope. He knew the road would be long, but he was prepared for every obstacle. With each new friend he made at the hospital, he found more reasons to move forward with his project. People who, like him, had gone through difficulties, but who didn't let their bitter experiences define them. These people inspired him to keep going, to believe that with hard work and resilience he could make a difference. Most importantly, Paul wanted people to see that even in the most difficult times, there is always a way out. In his conversations with other patients, Paul liked to use examples of figures he admired. He cited entrepreneurs and activists who had started with little, but who, through overcoming and altruism, managed to transform the world around them. For him, these stories were proof that, with humility and hard work, anyone could overcome their adversities and achieve great things. And that was what he wanted to convey to the children who would one day use his platform, that they were not alone and that the future could still be bright, regardless of what they had experienced so far. Paul knew his journey was still at the beginning. He still needed support, resources, and time to see his plan come to fruition. But that didn't discourage him. On the contrary, he saw every challenge as an opportunity to grow and learn more. He knew the road to overcoming was long, but he was ready to walk it. After all, he had a clear purpose: to help others find the strength to overcome their own traumas. And in that hospital, as he recovered, his dream of creating an online psychological support community began to take shape, one step at a time. Steve, still tormented by remorse, decided to deepen his investigations into Paul. He wasn't just seeking redemption. There was something more, a need to understand the depth of the impact he had made. When Steve finally discovered Paul's business plan, it was as if a wave of emotion hit him by surprise. Paul's idea of helping young people who had suffered bullying and childhood trauma was more than a simple project. It was an act of pure altruism, an attempt to transform pain into something positive. Steve couldn't hold back the tears when he discovered this, especially since, years before, he himself had faced something similar in his personal life. The memory of his son came back with a vengeance. The boy, who was once full of life, had been consumed by bullying at school. Steve had never been able to fully understand what his son was going through until it was too late. Signs of isolation and sadness had been ignored, and when his son began to have suicidal thoughts, Steve was unable to help effectively. He still carried the guilt of not having acted in time, of not having listened to his own son's silent pleas. Paul's story brought all of this back, and Steve saw, in that young man, a kind of redemption. He could, in some way, be part of this mission to save other young people, as he was unable to save his son. As he read more about Paul's plans, Steve began to understand that this young man's work was more than just a business idea. It was a life mission. Paul's project aimed to build a support network for children and teenagers who, like Steve's son, were at the mercy of their own pain and suffering. Using technology as a means of creating connections and offering help was something that deeply impressed Steve. He never imagined that technological advancement could be used in such a humane way, and it touched him in an indescribable way. He knew Paul was creating something his own son would have benefited from. Steve spent hours reflecting on the impact of this plan. He wondered how many young people could be saved, how many lives could be transformed if Paul's project came to fruition. Most impressive to Steve was the humility with which Paul seemed to approach this work. He wasn't seeking fame or recognition. All he wanted was to create a safe space for those, like him, who had been neglected by the system. This altruism moved something deep in Steve. He had never thought of business as something that could generate so much social impact. In his mind, business was just a way to make money. But Paul was proving there was another way to do it. Steve's emotions were running high. He never thought he could be so affected by someone else's story, especially someone he almost killed. Paul's personal drama, his ability to pick himself up and use his experience to help others, was an inspiration to Steve. He saw there an opportunity to finally find the peace he was looking for. Perhaps by supporting Paul's work, he could do something meaningful with the time and resources he had. What started as a search for redemption was now turning into something bigger, an opportunity to be part of something that really mattered. However, Steve also felt the weight of his own guilt. How could he get close to Paul after what he did? Noble as Paul's project was, Steve knew there was a barrier that would need to be broken before he could even think about offering his help. He was still the man who almost destroyed Paul's life. And even if Paul was a good-hearted person, would he be able to forgive Steve? These doubts gnawed at Steve inside, but at the same time encouraged him to look for a solution. He needed, in some way, to express his regret and show Paul that he wanted to help, not out of obligation, but because he believed in the importance of that project. Steve then decided that, before anything else, he needed to reconnect with his son, at least in memory. He went back to reading the boy's old diaries, where he described the anguish of being isolated at school and the pain of bullying. Each page read was a stab at Steve's heart, but it also served as a reminder of why he needed to move forward with this new mission. Paul's story resonated deeply with his own family history, and Steve couldn't let this opportunity to contribute pass him by. That project of Paul's was a second chance, one that Steve couldn't ignore. The emotional connection Steve felt with Paul, even without meeting him in person yet, was undeniable. He knew that somehow their paths were linked, and Paul's mission, although aimed at young people, was also a chance for Steve to redeem himself, not just with Paul, but with his own son and himself. As he continued to research and understand more about the project, Steve felt that the answer to his own overcoming was in offering everything he had to support that initiative. If he could save one life, who knows, it could start to repair some of the damage he's done in the past. Steve, now a former police officer, spent days and nights reliving the moment he shot Paul. The scene replayed in his mind like an endless nightmare, every detail recorded with painful precision. The crack of the gunshot, the muffled scream of pain, and above all, the look of fear in Paul's eyes. That expression haunted him. Guilt weighed like an anchor, pulling him deeper and deeper into his own reflections. He endlessly thought of every possible way to avoid the incident. If he had hesitated for a second longer, if he had made a different decision, perhaps Paul would have been moving on with his life without bearing the scars of violence he did not deserve. It was a drama that was eating him up inside. As Steve sank into these thoughts, his mind became a battlefield. Every decision he had made as a police officer now seemed suspect, every action revisited with a critical and merciless eye. He questioned whether he was really prepared for the burden that the role of a police officer required, or whether he, like many others, had lost his way in the attempt to maintain order at any cost. This internal upheaval, this struggle between what he believed he was and what his actions showed, created deep anguish. Remorse wouldn't leave him alone, but at the same time, something inside him began to transform. He knew he couldn't just move on as if nothing had happened. There was an important decision to be made. Steve, who had always considered himself a practical person, now found himself immersed in moral dilemmas he never imagined facing. The incident with Paul opened old wounds and forced him to face truths he had tried to hide from himself. He thought about his son, about the times he wasn't there, about the times he couldn't offer the support the boy needed. The connection between Paul and his son became even clearer. Both young, both victims of a system that fails to protect the most vulnerable. But while his son succumbed to pressure, Paul had resisted. He was alive, and that was what touched Steve most. It was a chance at redemption he had never had with his own son. As these thoughts consumed him, Steve began to feel a growing desire to act, to do something meaningful that could, in some way, repair the harm done. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could influence the future. And so, after many sleepless nights and days of reflection, he made a surprising decision. He didn't just want to ask Paul for forgiveness. He wanted to do more. He wanted to be part of the change Paul was creating. Steve realized that his role was now no longer as a police officer, but as someone who needed to help build something new, something that could positively impact the lives of other young people who, like his son, were suffering in silence. Steve's decision to seek a way to redeem himself, not just with Paul, but with himself, was a turning point. For the first time, he saw a way out of the darkness that had dominated his life. He still had resources, time, and, most of all, the desire to contribute to something bigger than himself. Steve knew he couldn't simply offer money or support without first confronting Paul and exposing the whole truth. He needed to be honest, open up, and tell Paul how that incident had changed his life forever. And at the same time, I needed to do this without expecting forgiveness or immediate acceptance. He knew Paul had every right to refuse him. As he thought about how to approach Paul, Steve began to mentally prepare himself for all the possible reactions he might receive. Maybe Paul didn't want to hear it. Perhaps he would be rejected immediately. But deep down, Steve knew he had to try. It was no longer just a question of personal redemption. He believed in Paul's project. He saw the potential it had to change lives. And that was the most important part of the decision he was about to make. He didn't want to get involved out of guilt or remorse, but because he believed that, alongside Paul, he could finally use his experience, however painful, to create a positive impact. Steve didn't know how Paul would react, but he was determined not to let his own history of regret define the future. He understood that to truly overcome his mistakes, he needed to commit to something bigger than himself. The decision to approach Paul was difficult, but he knew it was the first step of many he would need to take. And more than that, he needed to be ready to accept whatever came, whether rejection or acceptance. This was all part of the growth process that Steve had begun to follow. Steve finally decided he was ready to approach Paul. He knew he needed to be humble, that he couldn't expect Paul to welcome him with open arms. But humility had already become an intrinsic part of his new journey. He was prepared to listen, to learn, and most of all, to contribute in a sincere and meaningful way. It was a difficult path, but he knew it would be worth it. Now the question was just finding the right time to talk to Paul and expose the whole truth about his intentions. A meeting was about to happen, and Steve knew that nothing would be the same as before. Steve, with his heart in his hands and his thoughts confused, finally found the courage to meet Paul. He knew that the path to get there had not been easy, and that the young man had every right to reject him. However, the desire to contribute to Paul's project was greater than his fear. Steve had spent years saving money, hoping to one day invest in something that would make a difference. When he heard about Paul's plan, he saw the perfect opportunity to finally use those resources in a meaningful way. He believed that by joining forces, they could create something powerful and impact the lives of young people who, like his son, needed support. But deep down, he knew that this offer might be met with suspicion. When Steve showed up at Paul's door, the tension in the air was palpable. Paul was still recovering, both physically and emotionally, and the presence of the man who almost took his life made him uncomfortable. It was impossible not to feel the indignation that Paul carried in his eyes. He had been hurt unfairly, and now the man responsible for it stood before him, offering help. The situation seemed like a cruel irony, and Paul, even with his good heart, had difficulty understanding why Steve was there. He knew that deep down Steve probably felt remorse, but that didn't change the fact that he had been shot for no reason. Paul's mother, sensing the growing tension, did not hesitate to take action. She knew the pain her son had gone through and couldn't tolerate Steve's presence. Without thinking twice, he asked him to leave. It wasn't just an emotional reaction. It was a protective response from a mother who almost lost her son. For her, Steve's presence was a constant reminder of the suffering and fear that nearly devastated her family. She didn't want Paul to be exposed to any more pain. Steve, with all humility, respected the request and left, but deep down, he knew that this conversation wasn't over yet. Something inside him said Paul needed time. Upon leaving Paul's house, Steve felt a mix of frustration and sadness. He knew that despite his good intentions, things would not be simple. He had already imagined that facing Paul's mother would be difficult, but the real shock came from Paul's own reaction. The young man, so full of hope and determination, was filled with distrust. Steve couldn't blame him, but it made him more motivated to keep trying. He wouldn't give up so easily. After all, he wasn't just there to seek Paul's forgiveness, but also to help turn a dream into reality. Steve knew that sooner or later he would have another chance to talk to Paul. On the way home, Steve reflected on the complexity of the situation. He knew his partnership offer was fraught with conflicting feelings. On the one hand, there was a genuine desire to help. On the other, the weight of his responsibility for Paul's suffering. It was a fine line between altruism and atonement, and Steve was determined to walk that line carefully. He needed to show Paul that his intentions went beyond guilt. He believed deeply in the project and wanted to see it grow, not just as an investor, but as someone who wanted to be part of something transformative. He just needed to find the right way to show it. Paul, for his part, was torn, even after his mother's request. He couldn't just shake the idea that Steve was trying to redeem himself. Despite the hurt, Paul knew he was a person with a good heart, and this fact made him reflect. He had a grand plan and knew that, to get it off the ground, he would need resources. Steve could be the key to that, but trusting the man who almost took his life was a difficult barrier to overcome. Paul wondered if he would ever be able to look at Steve and see more than the police officer who made that terrible mistake. Deep down, Paul knew he needed time to process everything that was happening. He had a selfless spirit, and his desire to help others was immense, but the trauma he had suffered was still present, and Steve's figure was a constant reminder of that. Paul had dreams of building a community that would help heal young people like him who had suffered from bullying, indifference, and a lack of support. However, the emotional price of accepting Steve's help seemed too high. Paul knew he would need to make a difficult choice. Allow the hurt to stop him from moving forward, or give Steve the chance to show that he could truly contribute. Steve, on the other hand, was determined to move forward, even if the road was long and full of challenges. He knew that Paul's trust would not be gained overnight. The humility he had learned throughout this process made him understand that he would need patience. Steve was willing to wait as long as necessary and prove, through actions, that his intention was sincere. He didn't just want to invest financially, but to get directly involved in the project, helping with his own experience and bringing his vision to the future of the initiative. As the days went by, Steve began to plan new ways to get closer to Paul without forcing the situation. He knew that pressuring him wouldn't be the best approach. Instead, he decided he would show Paul that his support was unconditional, no matter how things turned out. Steve's decision to invest in that project went beyond any personal remorse. He saw the potential to transform lives, and that was something worth fighting for. Now all that was left was to wait and see if Paul would be willing to listen to his proposal with an open heart. After days of reflection, Paul made a difficult decision. He knew that, as painful as it was, he needed to hear what Steve had to say. The young man had a big heart, and despite all the trauma he still carried, there was something inside him that compelled him to give the former police officer a chance. Maybe it was his selfless nature, or maybe it was the fact that he always believed in overcoming, even in the darkest of times. Either way, Paul decided he couldn't let his hurt and outrage define the course of his life. He needed to listen to Steve, understand his intentions, and perhaps find some way to move forward. When Steve returned to Paul's house, he was visibly nervous. He knew this conversation could change everything. It wasn't just about asking for forgiveness, but about showing Paul that his regret was genuine and that he was willing to do something to make amends, even if minimally, for the mistake he had made. As they sat facing each other, the atmosphere was heavy. Paul's mother, still skeptical, watched from a distance, worried about what this conversation might mean for her son. But Paul, determined to listen, asked her to give him space. Steve, in turn, felt a mix of humility and gratitude for that opportunity. Knowing he wouldn't waste it, Steve began to speak with a trembling voice, and his first words were a sincere request for forgiveness. He explained that since the incident, he couldn't go a day without thinking about what he had done. He told how remorse consumed him and how that tragedy had made him reevaluate his entire life. Paul, shocked by Steve's vulnerability, listened in silence. Seeing that man, who had previously looked so imposing in his police uniform, now so humble and emotionally shaken, was something that completely disarmed him. For the first time, Paul realized how deeply Steve's mistake had also affected him. The conversation unfolded intensely. Steve didn't hide anything. He admitted all his faults and told how the feeling of guilt led him to abandon his police career. He talked about his son, about the suicidal thoughts the boy had due to bullying, and how that connected him, in some way, to Paul's mission. Steve's every word carried an emotional weight that couldn't be ignored. Paul, who had spent years dealing with his own grief, was touched to see that, in some ways, he and Steve shared a commonality. They had both been marked by tragedies that changed them forever. As shocked as he was by what he was hearing, Paul couldn't deny that something inside him was changing. He knew he couldn't keep carrying the hate for Steve, especially after hearing his story. The humility with which Steve stood before him, the sincerity in his eyes, and the emotion in his voice showed that this was not the same man who had pulled the trigger months ago. Steve was broken, just like Paul, but there was something inspiring about the way he was trying to rebuild himself. Paul, who always believed in the ability to give new meaning to pain, began to wonder if Steve deserved this chance too. After hours of conversation, the atmosphere between them began to change. What initially seemed like an insurmountable barrier, little by little, began to dissolve. Paul, with his generous heart, began to see more in Steve than the man who had hurt him. He saw someone who was trying, in every way possible, to redeem himself. Steve, in turn, felt that he had finally been able to connect with Paul in an honest and authentic way. The conversation that began with a plea for forgiveness now turned into something deeper, a heartfelt exchange between two men who, in different ways, had been transformed by suffering. When Steve started talking about Paul's project, the change in tone was immediate. Paul's eyes lit up as he listened to someone who not only believed in his vision, but wanted to be a part of it. Steve explained that, upon learning about the business plan, he felt a deep connection with Paul's mission and saw a chance to help young people who, like his son, were at the mercy of their own pain. Paul, upon hearing this, began to realize that Steve wasn't just there out of remorse. He truly believed in the potential of the project and was willing to invest not only money, but also time and effort to make it happen. Paul was surprised by Steve's sincerity. He didn't expect the ex-cop to be so emotionally invested in the idea. But at the same time, seeing Steve so excited and committed made Paul feel like maybe, just maybe, it was possible to give this partnership another chance. The decision to listen to Steve had been difficult, but now, after hours of conversation, Paul was beginning to see that there was much more at stake than just whether or not to forgive. There was a real possibility of turning that shared pain into something positive, into something that could help other people overcome their own traumas. After the intense and emotional initial conversation, something curious began to happen between Steve and Paul. With the ice broken, the two began to discover that they had more in common than they imagined. Between one conversation and another, they began to share small details about their personal lives, and that's when they noticed an unexpected connection: similar hobbies. Steve, who has always been passionate about sports and the outdoors, discovered that Paul shared this passion as well. It was as if, little by little, a bond was being formed, a bridge being built between two people who, despite all the drama they faced, had more similarities than differences. Paul, who used to spend his days off playing basketball in a local park, was surprised to learn that Steve also played, even though he hadn't done so in a while. Their passion for sport was one of the first topics that brought them together in a light and relaxed way. As they talked about the games and the teams they followed, the tension between them dissipated. It was almost as if, in that moment, They could put aside what had happened and connect like two normal people with common interests. For Steve, that moment was a small ray of hope. He felt like he was finally able to get closer to Paul in a way that didn't involve guilt or apologies. As the conversation flowed, Steve began to realize how passionate Paul was about what he did. As the young man began to talk in more detail about his business plan, Steve could see the genuine enthusiasm in his eyes. Paul spoke with infectious energy about the idea of creating an online community that could truly help children and young people overcome trauma, something he considered his life's mission. Steve, who was already impressed by Paul's resilience and humility, was even more inspired to see the sparkle in the young man's eyes. Here was a boy who, despite everything he had suffered, had not given up fighting for a better world. The sparkle in Paul's eyes as he talked about his project reminded Steve of his own son. He thought about how the boy, on his good days, spoke with the same passion about his dreams and ambitions. The connection between Paul's enthusiasm and his son's memories created in Steve an even greater desire to be part of that plan. He didn't just want to be an investor. He wanted to be present. He wanted to contribute in some way to make this dream come true. Steve knew that, in some way, this project could help heal wounds, not just Paul's, but his own. From that point on, the conversation between the two took a more focused turn. Steve began asking Paul about the details of the business plan, how he planned to finance the initiative, and what kind of technical and professional support he would need. Paul, without hesitation, began to explain how he intended to develop the platform, what his main objectives were, and how he dreamed of expanding the project to reach as many young people as possible. Steve, who has always had an analytical streak, due to his experience as a police officer, began to suggest some ideas and strategies, offering a practical perspective on how they could structure the business efficiently. The more they talked, the more Steve became involved in the project. He began sharing his own ideas about how they could partner with schools and NGOs to bring Paul's platform to young people in all parts of the country. Steve knew that, with the right support, Paul's project could become something much bigger than he imagined, and that possibility excited him. He saw in this business not only a way to honor his son's memory, but also to do something meaningful with his life. Steve felt like he had finally found a purpose, something worth fighting for. The conversation continued for hours. Paul, initially surprised by Steve's interest, now saw him as a possible ally. Despite the doubts that still hung in the air, Paul began to consider the idea of having Steve as a partner. He knew he would need financial support, and that Steve, with his experience and resources, could help turn the project into something tangible. However, there was something even more important to Paul. He wanted to make sure that Steve was truly committed to the cause, that he wasn't just there to assuage his own guilt. Paul needed to believe that Steve shared his vision and was willing to invest not just money, but also his heart and soul into this business. Little by little, a kind of complicity was formed. Steve, who began the conversation full of insecurities and remorse, now felt like he was building something meaningful with Paul. And Paul, who initially resisted the idea of accepting any kind of help from Steve, began to see the ex-cop differently. There were still wounds that needed to be healed, but in that moment, as they discussed the details of the business plan, it seemed like they were both starting on a path toward healing. Together, they realized that Paul's project was much more than just a business. It was a mission that could change the lives of many young people. As the conversation progressed, Steve realized there was something he hadn't yet revealed to Paul, something deeply personal. He felt that to truly build an honest and solid partnership, he needed to share his son's story. With a heavy heart, Steve began to talk about the difficulties his son faced at school. He talked about the moments of isolation, about the constant bullying that the boy suffered, and how, little by little, that took away all his joy. Paul, upon hearing this, fell silent, realizing that Steve's story had an unexpected connection to everything they were trying to build. Steve continued, explaining that, even though he tried to be a good father, he never knew exactly how to help his son overcome the trauma of bullying. The boy began to avoid school, to isolate himself in his room, and Steve, stuck in his routine as a police officer, was often not there when his son needed him most. The signs were there, but Steve didn't recognize them in time. The pain in Steve's voice was evident. and Paul felt immediate empathy. He knew how bullying could destroy a person's confidence and self-esteem, and now he saw that Steve had gone through similar pain, a pain that connected him deeply to the cause Paul championed. It was then that Steve revealed the most difficult point in his story: his son's suicide attempts. Paul, who until then had remained calm, was taken by surprise. He didn't imagine Steve was carrying such a heavy burden. Steve's words brought to light a tragedy that Paul knew very well, even though he had never experienced anything like it. The young man realized that the meeting between him and Steve was not just a coincidence. There seemed to be something bigger at play, something that linked their stories in ways they were both still trying to understand. Steve, who had seemed so impenetrable, was now exposed, vulnerable in front of Paul. In sharing his son's story, Steve wasn't seeking compassion, but rather genuine connection. He wanted Paul to know that his willingness to invest in the project didn't just come from a feeling of guilt or an attempt at personal redemption. For Steve, this project represented a chance to help other young people not go through what his son went through. It was an opportunity to transform suffering into something constructive, to be part of an initiative that could save lives. And Steve knew that, alongside Paul, he could really make a difference. Hearing all this, Paul began to understand that Steve was, in fact, committed to the cause. The atmosphere between the two changed again. Now there was a mutual understanding, a kind of silent alliance that was being formed. Paul, with his own baggage of trauma, and Steve, with the pain of losing his son, were linked by a greater mission. Paul, who was initially reluctant to trust Steve, began to see that maybe, just maybe, he could give the ex-cop a chance. Steve's story was tough, and Paul knew many young people faced similar challenges. It was impossible to ignore the emotional depth of that conversation. Steve was offering more than money. He was offering himself, willing to fight for this cause with body and soul. With the revelation of his story, Steve made the offer he had been saving for some time. He wanted to invest in Paul's project, and not just with money, but also with your experience, your time, and your energy. Steve believed that Paul's project had the potential to change lives and wanted to be a part of it in any way possible. He explained that when investing in the business, he didn't just want to be a distant financier, but an active partner, someone who was there to help structure the platform, form partnerships, and ensure that the project reached as many young people as possible. Paul was surprised by the offer, but at the same time, something inside him said this could work. Paul knew he still needed to process everything that had been said, but now, with Steve's story in mind, he began to see the project in a new way. It was as if what once seemed like just his dream was now something bigger, something shared. He was beginning to understand that by allowing Steve to be a part of this, he could give other young people the chance Steve's son never had. And this possibility touched him deeply. Throughout his life, Paul always believed in the power of overcoming, and now more than ever, he saw that this overcoming could come through an unlikely but genuine partnership. After what seemed like an eternity of reflection, Paul looked at Steve and, with a deep sigh, thanked him for his sincerity. He still wasn't completely sure how to move forward, but he knew this was the first step to something bigger. The idea of working alongside Steve, of joining forces to create something that could really make a difference, started to seem like a real possibility. And at that moment, Paul made the decision to give that partnership a chance. It wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to try. Together, they could turn that shared pain into something positive, something that would have a lasting impact on other people's lives. After diving into this story full of overcoming, remorse, and emotional upheavals, the big question is, what are you going to do with all of this? How many times have you faced your own mistakes and turned them into opportunities to grow? Do you, like Steve, have the courage to face your ghosts and, alongside someone you hurt, create something greater than yourself? The real learning here is that, no matter how painful a situation may be, there is always room to rise again, ask for forgiveness, and build something new. But that only happens if you take the first step. Are you ready for this? And speaking of steps, how about taking the next one right now? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to continue following stories like this, which not only inspire, but show that transformation and altruism can begin where we least expect it. Don't just watch from the sidelines, Be part of this journey of learning and growth. After all, we all have something to overcome, and knowledge can be the key to that change.